If you're looking for a getaway this winter for rejuvenation and transformation, join Psychedelics today for our Vital Retreat at Blue Osa in Costa Rica. Blue Osa is an eco-resort that's all about harmony with nature. It's nestled between the jungle and the beach and primarily runs on solar power. And included in your Vital journey are 8 days and 7 nights accommodation, 4 transpersonal breathwork sessions, 2 as a breather and 2 as a sitter, 3 farm-to-table meals per day, and you'll also receive a $50 gift certificate for the on-site Blue Osa spa so you can indulge in some relaxation. Spend your free time taking a dip in the natural pool, exploring miles of secluded jungle beaches, and experience guided birdwatching hikes at sunrise. Stay active with daily yoga, intuitive movement, and CrossFit practices to keep your body and mind in sync. There's also free Wi-Fi if you wish to stay connected. Your group airport transportation is also included, making it a hassle-free adventure. So if you're ready to reconnect with nature, yourself, and other like-minded healers and professionals, join us this January 6th through 13th, 2024. Visit psychedelicstoday.com/events and scroll down to the Costa Rica retreat page for more info.
Vital, our 12-month practitioner training program, is back for its 3rd cohort starting January 2024. The last 2 cohorts have been nothing short of transformational, both personally and professionally, for everyone involved, and here's a little taste of what makes it so special. Vital is a process-oriented curriculum, focusing on multidisciplinary perspectives and wisdom traditions, guiding students through powerful inner work and building practical skills to support lifelong growth. Through lectures, study groups, elective modules, retreats, and process papers, you'll have all the support you need to develop your own vision and model for entering this exciting field. Applications for Vital are open until December the 20th, with early bird discounts available until November the 19th. We invite you to apply early to improve your chances of being accepted into this global community of the next generation of psychedelic wellness practitioners. So, head to vitalpsychedelictraining.com to download our full course curriculum and learn more about this transformative journey.
All right. Ted Riskin, welcome to Psychedelics today. Really excited to be sitting here with you today, which looks like the Journey space where you host your group ketamine experiences here in North Carolina. Yeah, would love to hear a little bit more about who you are as a person and who is Ted.
How much time do we have for this part of it? I feel like I should stick to a more professional aspect of that. So basically, my background is in holotropic breathwork, core energetics, internal family systems, and what we're doing here is kind of drawing on all of those. So it's really fun to be able to use a bunch of the tricks in my bag.
Yeah. Amazing. I think I first I've known about your work for quite a while, and I think I got introduced to your work through Lenny Elizabeth Gibson. I think they might have mentioned your name when you were living down in Jersey as a breathwork facilitator down in that area. But also, I participated in a breathwork, a little mini workshop that you did at one of the Somatic, was it the Association for Body Psychotherapy in Rhode Island. And it was a really interesting workshop because that was my first exposure to breathwork with internal family systems. And I never really thought about tying internal family systems into the breathwork experience. And I'm curious, you have this training in holotropic breathwork and IFS. How did you end up kind of fusing these together?
Well, I'm also trained in another form of breathwork where we would sometimes do sessions in water. Cold water or warm water. And it was after one of those sessions, and I was just starting to learn the IFS model. And, I did my breath work, and I was just kind of lying on the side of the pool, and some of my parts started complaining to me. Like, we hate this. And you're mean. Like this, your word, and they didn't use these words, but it's like, we didn't consent to this. And they agreed that good stuff was happening, but they didn't like that I would do this technique that would disable them against their will.
Interesting. So, I think a lot of folks probably that listen to the podcast, they're familiar with internal family systems. But could you just explain a little bit about that? You brought up protectors and whatnot. People are like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I drank so much of this Kool-Aid, sometimes I forget that.
It's cool. We're all in our little bubble.
Yeah, definitely. So to me, and in this model, we'll see a person as consisting of self, which is, it's all that, the presence, the spaciousness, the witness, and everything else is parts. So whatever else is going on, we can identify that as a part, and we can start to interact with that part and see what it needs and what it's trying to do for us. And it's a way to really get some traction with the system and rearrange it to a more healthy, which we would call self-led way of being in the world. So when I say my parts are complaining, it's just those are protectors whose job it is to make sure I'm in control or that things make sense. And it's very hard for them. And maybe people don't even know what happens in breathwork, but it's sort of like psychedelics where the controlling functions of the mind or the controlling parts just can't do that. So for them, it's not a good thing.
Right. And I know there's like a huge wait list to get into IFS training and modules nowadays. And especially there's been this huge growing interest in the psychedelic community around infusing IFS into this work. Why do you think this is a good model for the psychedelic world? Like, why are people so fascinated about this modality and this practice?
Well, I've just been thinking about that because I made a little video, and now I'm trying to remember. I think I had 3 points one way and 4 the other. So why is IFS helpful for psychedelics? One, and Michael Mithoefer talks about this, that just naturally when people get into that space, they realize they have parts, they talk about their parts. So understanding, it's like, oh, it's really true. This is how the psyche is arranged. So that's helpful. Another is just what I was saying, that once you get that some parts don't want to do psychedelics, then you can talk to them and see what their concerns are and make deals with them. Like, well, we'll make sure someone's here, or what do you need to be okay, and give consent. And I think in any decision, if a part doesn't give consent, it's liable to interrupt what's happening or create some blowback or sabotage. So I think it's really useful going into a psychedelic experience to seek out the parts that are afraid or don't want to do it and see what they need to be okay with it. And the third one, I'm not recalling it.
Oh, good.
I have to come back to that.
Well, that's interesting to think about these parts that are afraid, anxious, and trying to get consent. And I think this is pretty common for folks that are starting to engage in inner work, whether it's breath work, psychedelics. We always kind of have that saying, the process really begins when you first make that conscious decision to engage in the work. And some people do get really afraid, like, maybe weeks beforehand and want to back out and say, I don't know if I want to do this, right? So how does one, I guess, like start that conversation and understand what consent is? Because I could imagine too, I'm thinking about myself, I'm like going back and forth with these different parts of myself. And one part's like, yes, do it. And another part's like, no, I'm afraid, don't do this yet. And, you can get really confused. So I guess, how do you trust that process and develop that relationship?
Well, if I'm talking to you and you're coming to me to have an experience and you say, I want to do it, I don't know if that's all of you talking or if just your gung-ho psychedelics, I'm going to heal the fuck out of myself part has taken over. And maybe that's all I'm hearing from. So I'm going to want to look and ask, are there any parts that are reluctant or have concerns? Yeah, so there's consent. Legal consent is that somebody says, I want to do it. But full consent is that all of their parts are aligned with that.
Yeah, this is probably like a new concept for a lot of folks. And I wonder, for you, is there a somatic quality to that? Of like, maybe intellectually one part's like, I don't know. But like, I guess it's that thing. If it's not a full yes, it's a no. And like, do we feel that somatically in our body?
That's an interesting question. I think that's a good way to know if there's something in us that's not a yes. I find that so what we do is we educate people about IFS and about parts and give them some practice at identifying parts, and then just ask, like, check for any parts that are having concerns or fears or reluctance. And I think if you ask, they'll talk.
Yeah. I think for me, I'm just thinking about it, and probably, I guess the reason why I asked that is like, I can get maybe a little too like intellectual with it and go back and forth. And there's also, I can tune in and I know when something just doesn't sit right in my body. I can get too in my mind and be like, these parts can just start jabbering. And
yeah. Well, parts can communicate to us through words or through feelings, images, and especially ones that are very young or maybe pre-verbal. They don't even talk to us, but they can still let us know that they're there and what they need.
Yeah. So we're in this space where you host some group ketamine sessions. I would love to learn more about how these sessions work. How did you get involved in this this type of work, and why you started offering it, and things that you've learned throughout the 2 years that you've been doing this.
Yeah, I think we're learning a lot, but the impetus came the first time I did ketamine, and about 15 minutes in, it felt so much like doing holotropic breathwork that I wondered why people were being paid to sit, because that's not how we do it in holotropic breathwork.
Right.
In holotropic breathwork, we find that people are wonderful sitters. Coming on and off the street. They provide everything that's needed, especially if you're not doing sessions, under the medicine or under the non-ordinary state. So, I hesitate to use this word downloaded because we're in Nashville and people are just always like, I downloaded what flavor ice cream to get, but it was kind of like that. It just all of a sudden it's like, well, why couldn't we do holotropic breathwork workshop and just substitute the ketamine for the breathing? And I'd done that a long time ago with MDMA. So back in the day, we did we called them special workshops. So it was like a holotropic breathwork workshop, but you got some MDMA instead, and it was really wonderful.
Yeah.
So I knew that kind of model could work. So the first 2 times we did this, we did it with sitters, and the sitters were getting bored. So as you know, in holotropic breathwork, it can be quite dramatic, and there can be a lot for a sitter to do.
Yeah.
And even if their person is just lying there, someone else in the room might get very active. But in the ketamine journeys, people were basically just lying there. And plus it was a long day and we had to make dinner. And so the next one we said, let's do it without sitters. And we've been doing it ever since. It's very easy to hold space. We can fit 9 people on mats in this room, and we've never felt like there was too much going on that we can handle. And we survey people. We have them fill out forms, and we always ask that, do you feel there was enough coverage? And we've never had someone say there's not enough coverage. We have 2 people holding space for 9.
Yeah, that seems pretty decent. And I think, the first time I sat with a client with ketamine, there's not much happening. I mean, it was interesting. I think I was doing a little bit more psycholytic therapy with some folks. So there was a little bit more engagement happening. But I mean, a lot of people are pretty quiet on ketamine. So that's really interesting to hear that some people weren't maybe getting the benefit of maybe being a sitter. But I don't know, do you see that as like a training model though? Like if people are like looking to have an experience to kind of do this sitter journeyer pair, or is it just not too much is happening? And
I never thought about that. I think it could be interesting if you're in a training to have the experience of just sitting there. I think you could learn a lot about your own parts and the parts of you that want to help the person or do something or be useful. So I think there could be value in that, but it just doesn't seem to be required to create a safe environment like we would do it in breathwork. In breathwork, I would not have more than 4 people without using sitters.
And why is that?
There's just too much more involved in creating the holding environment in a safe space. Physically safe, I mean.
Yeah.
There's just more going on. So I don't know, maybe in breathwork, people are more tuned in and feeling that person just being there. Whereas if you're taking a dissociative, maybe it's just not so important. I don't know. It's like, I'm fine. I'm out. I don't need someone next to me right now. I'm just fine.
Yeah.
Breathwork can be a little scarier, maybe. It doesn't have that kind of calming effect of the medicine of ketamine. So perhaps having that person who's dedicated to you is actually helpful.
That's interesting to hear you say breath work could be a little scarier at times, because a lot of people think like, oh, maybe I'm not going to have a big experience. But I've been finding that, sometimes the medicine actually, like whether it's like ketamine or psilocybin, when we're doing psilocybin retreats, can be really quiet. And people are just like really in their experience, whereas breath work, I mean, you have people rolling around on the ground, screaming, crying, all sorts of stuff. So it does take a little bit of a different, I guess, space holding to deal with a little bit more of that chaos that's unfolding. And sometimes, that doesn't happen in breathwork sessions, and you get sessions that are super quiet and you're not having to do anything as a sitter or facilitator. But it does seem a little bit more activating.
And I think people underestimate the power of breathwork. And often, so these days, a lot more people are coming to do breathwork for the first time, and they have done psychedelics. In the past, that was more the minority. Now it's probably the majority.
Yeah.
And I'll tell them, the difference is, like, you were used to riding a motorcycle, and now this is a bicycle. You got to pedal this one. And yet they're shocked sometimes that how deep just the breathing takes them.
Are some people coming out of that saying that maybe it's on par with some of their psychedelic experiences, or people finding it as a useful integration tool? Like, how are people shocked?
I think they're shocked how powerful it was and how altered they were just from the breathing and how intense. And I guess they thought, oh, this will be like psilocybin light or something.
Right.
And it's not.
And personal question, feel free to answer it how you want. Did you have an experience with psychedelics before breathwork and starting your training, or did you have a breathwork experience and kind of going into training? And how would you compare? Because I remember my first time, I had lots of psychedelic experiences in my early 20s, and then coming to breathwork thinking nothing's going to happen. This is a bunch of weirdness, and completely blown away, going, whoa, that was more powerful than anything I've experienced to some degree.
I had a little bit of psychedelic experience, but I had done breathwork sort of in the rebirthing form before doing the holotropic training. And I think for me, in the psychological realm, it blew me away. So it got me in touch with having feelings that I had no idea were there.
Yeah.
So I was impressed by breathwork in that way. And of course, then doing holotropic breathwork, where you open up the whole transpersonal realm, then you see where you can get,
Yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like we could keep chatting about breath work, and maybe we'll come back to it. But I want to come back to the group ketamine sessions. And I know you've been using some screening tools and taking some surveys, or maybe that's the correct term, surveys. So you're collecting some data around this. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what you're trying to measure with some of the participants that are coming in?
Yeah, so we're just doing 3 surveys. One of them, we're just continuing because we started, and that one's nature relatedness. And I wanted to do that one because someone told me that psychedelics increase nature relatedness except for ketamine, and that ketamine was actually decreasing the scores on nature relatedness. I don't know if that's true, but someone shared that with me.
Yeah.
And since as part of our program, we're taking people down to a stream and introducing them to a way of just being and connecting with nature, we wanted to see. The problem with the nature relatedness scale is people start pretty high, right? Because people aren't coming in and answering a survey by saying, oh yeah, nature sucks, I hate it. So that's not moving much, but the other 2 are. And the main one is called the DAS-21, so it's depression, anxiety, and stress. And so far, pre and post, we're seeing about a 2/3 reduction. So our average numbers, I think, are going from about 51 to under 18 for depression and anxiety and stress. And then because this program is very IFS oriented, we're measuring what's called self-leadership, which is, how do you describe what self-leadership is? On one hand, it's just the ability that all of the decisions I'm making in life are made from self, from a central place, taking into account all the parts, like we were saying earlier about consent. So a self-led decision to do psychedelics would include consent from all the parts. And otherwise, it's like my gung-ho psychedelics part gets me to do it, and the other part gets pushed aside. But self-leadership also includes just feelings of calm and presence and love, really. And so all of these things get measured in that scale.
Are you seeing an increase in self-leadership after?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So there's a friend of mine who came and did this as a participant observer. His name is Dr. Bob Swope. And so he's helping with some research and writing some of this up. And we're realizing that there's so many things happening that it's impossible to tease it apart. So we don't know how much the ketamine increases self-leadership. We don't know if it's the IFS work that people are doing, but I suspect it's a combination that the ketamine seems to really lubricate the IFS work and invite protectors to relax so that people can go deeper, and the rearrangement of the techniques of IFS happens much more deeply.
Be interesting to, I guess, like take the variable of IFS out and teaching it, and then kind of measuring those qualities of self-leadership. And yeah, I wonder if like teaching or talking about IFS, people are starting to become a little bit more familiar with those terms and starting to like resonate versus like not talking about it and then like measuring those qualities.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I couldn't do that, but anyone who has an infusion center could do that because they're not doing all these other things. But there's and we also think the group experience is as powerful as anything else that's happening. And especially when people are anxious or depressed, often they have assumptions about how they will be welcomed by other people. And to be in a loving group where people are vulnerable and find out, like, I can say anything. I can talk about all of my shame and fears, and people are just with me and accepting. And I sometimes wonder if that's doing more than the medicine even.
Well, I think you see that in, I don't know, you've done probably group therapy or just even in the breathwork model, right? Of like just being seen, heard, witnessed, accepted when people are very vulnerable. Because I think that's what one of our like probably greatest fears is being rejected from a group. Because from our evolution, that meant you'd probably die if you had to get kicked out and be on your own. So I think there is just something healing there. Do you know of anybody that's starting to collect research on group ketamine? I'm trying to think. I don't know anything off the top of my head. But so this is like really fascinating that you're trying to collect some data to measure people's change.
I can't remember if Bob, because he did look at the literature, and I believe there's a little bit out there at this point about doing ketamine in groups, but not much. So I'm excited to see what he ends up publishing about it.
Yeah. What if, I guess you learned about yourself in this process of doing group ketamine over the years?
About myself. The ketamine is teaching me stuff about myself. And then I see it applied as I'm doing my work. And I share it with the group just to kind of model, like talking about parts. So I think last week I was noticing the part of me that likes to control what's happening. And it's well-intentioned, wants everyone to have a good experience. And it thinks if all of the particles are exactly where I think they should be, then people will have a good experience. And it's been so much more able to let that go and just roll with it. And it's nice. I like it better that way.
Yeah, I mean, as a facilitator, you want to make sure, you're creating that safe container, but then also how do you let go of certain aspects and see where maybe the group wants to go. Have you done any, I guess, individual KAP work? And then if you have, how has that like been different than the group ketamine experience?
Yeah. So I'm as a client and as a practitioner have been, I don't want to say playing with, but learning about how that can be helpful. And I'm finding it really interesting and mostly using about like a quarter of what an initial dose would be for our group program. So you call it psycholytic. And the IFS sessions or the therapy sessions just seem so much deeper and easier. So
in the individual therapy sessions.
As individual therapy, yeah.
I've noticed that too. And especially when you're like, I don't know how much talking or interaction is happening in the group, but I've noticed in individual therapy, it's almost like this, like maybe like low dose of like MDMA where the client's like way more engaged, their defenses are down a little bit, and we're able to do kind of like more relational, psycholytic, somatic work. But that's probably not happening in the group sessions, right? Like you're probably not engaging as much as you could be in individual work.
Well, but we're doing it after, right? So we suggest that people just lie on their mat for an hour and no talking is happening. We're playing music and then for the second hour, they have an option. And some people just stay there for the full second hour. Some people will journal, go be in nature, do a mandala. But then, we have an integration experience and then we have a sharing circle, but it's more of a processing circle. So that's when we're kind of sometimes doing therapy and people are still somewhat under the effect.
Yeah.
And we're assuming that the neuroplasticity is lasting for several days. So then we do a Zoom session a couple of days after the medicine is taken and further process. So definitely I can see even then people are dropping in. It feels like what we call protectors are just calmer and more willing to let stuff happen. And then people can feel into other parts in a much more vivid way. And other parts that normally would sabotage, like a critic jumping in or distractions, aren't doing that. And the work goes much more easily.
I found that to be a really interesting quality with ketamine from my own kind of ketamine therapy sessions, where it's like that critic just goes offline and I could get into a lot of those like ruminative thoughts. And within ketamine, it seems like that's dampened. Do you notice that in people's experiences where they're not engaging so much in those thought patterns, where they're able to kind of take a break from it?
Yes. And sometimes it comes out more and it seems like that's an opportunity to really get to know the part.
How interesting.
So, we were talking earlier about interventions versus non-interventions. And sometimes you can do an intervention, say in breath work, and then someone says, you just ruined my experience. But was that how do you know? Is that a bad thing? Because now they got in touch with something else.
Right.
Like you mentioned someone who felt abandoned by something that happened. And well, maybe that's a good thing. Now it's time to get to know the part of you that's holding all this abandonment. So it's hard to say how it should come down,
Yeah, let's maybe dig into this conversation because it's pretty nuanced, I think. And I think we're still so early on of trying to figure out like how to ideally kind of hold this type of space. And I think a lot of kind of the protocols have been from those early years, and especially from that like non-directive approach of like, let the client, the participant have their experience, eye shades, really focused inward. But how do we know when to intervene? And how do we do that appropriately? And so, you made this analogy of like intervention from like the IFS Dick Schwartz model versus this non-directive approach from Tav and Stan from the holotropic breathwork model. And how do we navigate this as psychedelic therapies start to evolve?
Well, I have an answer for that, which is I don't know. How would I know? But I feel like it's always about balance. And if we're too far in one direction, it's always useful to get some guidance back towards the center. And so learning holotropic breathwork as a therapist, that was a good direction for me to go in, that I don't have to be the one to know what to do, or it's not my training and wisdom that's really going to make the difference. And so I think holotropic breathwork did a wonderful job of guiding people towards that non-interventive way of being. And I've heard Dick talk about this, that fine, but there's opportunities missed. And I think with anything, if we can do both, like if we're comfortable providing some guidance, but we're also comfortable not providing guidance. And I think for a lot of people, like the holotropic training is in part learning to be comfortable not doing anything.
Right.
So once you are good at not doing anything, and then you can also have some tools that IFS teaches, things you can do. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the practitioner, right? Like, so a part of me might say, ooh, I know what to do here. I have a really smart idea.
Yeah.
And then if that part takes over, it's probably not going to go well. But if I can ask that part to relax and then just be in a place of quiet, I kind of feel in my body like whether to do something or not. I'm either end up doing it or end up not doing it.
Right.
And it's not even a thought process.
Yeah. And I think for most like Western trained therapists and doctors, like, you know, very trained in more of a directive approach. And so to get that training and like a non-directive approach and sitting with yourself is actually like unlearning a lot of like what your training is all about, which can be really helpful. I wonder, you know, do you have any examples of when you're like conflicted in, you know, whether it's breath work or the group KAP, where you're like, you know, how do I navigate this right now?
All the time. And as a practitioner in general, even as a therapist, I tend to trust the client's or the participant's own wisdom and tend to back off. And sometimes they don't like it, you know, like I'm giving them too much responsibility. And I'm actually more open now to understanding where I'm a little indoctrinated into each person should learn to take care of themselves. And more open that we do need each other. And there's nothing wrong with drawing on resources from outside of us.
Right.
But yeah, it usually is that a part of me has an idea and then another part of me says, leave them alone. And then I just hold both and then one or the other happens.
Yeah, yeah. And I wonder how much of this is an art and science, right? Like I can imagine some of this is like intuition, right? Like you could have the playbook, you could know what to theoretically do, but then you're in the moment. And how much of that is just kind of intuition and reading the room, reading nonverbals and trying to integrate all the information that's coming in and making a decision?
Ultimately, I think it is that, but it's informed. Right. So my verbal, logical, analytical part will have an idea, but then I don't do anything until I've felt some quiet. So intuition. I think, you know, in the IFS model, to find self-leadership, it means we need to help all the parts that are needing healing. So how an IFS approach to this would be, oh, I have a protector that says I have to be useful. I have to prove my skills. I have to earn the money they're paying by doing a good thing. And then the work would be, well, what if I didn't do that? Then I'm going to find a part that feels undeserving or worthless, or they're going to think that I'm not worth it, or and then I have to find that part and be with it and understand where that part has had those feelings intensely in the past and help that part come out of the past. And when I can sit with that, then I have a choice of whether to intervene or not to intervene. But if I can't tolerate the feeling of being a useless person, my protector will make me do something.
Right. Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of sitting with yourself in those moments and really kind of paying attention of like how this situation may be triggering maybe these certain parts in ourselves where the protector is coming out or this critic is coming out, and then kind of dialoguing a little bit in that moment, and figuring out maybe like what's the appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, I think IFS is sort of half that, where you learn to work with your parts in the moment, and then half going to your sessions and doing the therapy to provide the healing that IFS can provide. Right. So it's shamanic, really. We're retrieving parts from the past where they're stuck and unburdening their traumas. And once they're healed, once the exiles, like the vulnerable ones, the ones that just hold the feelings and beliefs, are helped, that's what allows the protectors to relax and not have to jump in. And instead of jumping in, they may say, like my partner will say, I have a real smart thing you could do.
Right.
But it's okay if I don't do it.
Yeah. And it sounds like you also work with other facilitators. So how much of that is checking in with your team too? Like, do you check in with your team and kind of bounce these ideas? Be like, should I do this right now? Like what's going on?
It's true. We do that. Yeah. So we'll see somebody and sometimes we'll have a little talk. So either Amy or Sarah, and with both of them. And I feel like they're actually much more intuitive than I am and much better at that kind of intervention. So I tend to leave it to them.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll discuss sometimes, should we let this person be or should we do something?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's like the group model versus kind of like individual. It's like, it is really nice to have, that team around. So you can do some like, brainstorming, some checking in. I'm just thinking about a small little breathwork thing that Joe and I did at a conference, and somebody was like just screaming to the top of their lungs and singing. And I was getting triggered of like, I have this space to protect. Are they annoying people? Like, should I shut them up? Like, and I usually never try to do that. And I was, this close of like, I'm going to go over there and tell them to stop singing because it's disruptive. But then I had to check in and be like, maybe it's just disrupting me. But thankfully, it was like, hey, Joe, like, is this person disrupting you? Like, how are you feeling? And we made the ultimate decision not to do anything, but it was really nice to like, be able to work in teams and to kind of like, toss things back and forth to kind of check in with ourselves and be like, I guess this is my trigger that maybe I need to work with right now.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. Totally, like really wondering where's the balance between what that one person's needs are, the needs of the group, and then what's my own reaction.
Yeah.
And having that other person can really help at least get clear about the last one.
Yeah.
And then we just make the call, what's going to be best for everybody.
Yeah. And it is so nuanced. And sometimes we don't really know what's going on with people. Like I was sharing a little bit before we got recording, we had a session where somebody just put a blanket over somebody, right? Just the human caretaker, and you think your feet are cold and let me cover somebody up. But then that actually triggering a very big response with somebody. And so that's where this conversation gets like so interesting. It's like, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, how do we really navigate this? And, I don't know what the long-term follow-up was, but maybe that was something that they needed to work on. And that was actually the perfect trigger in that moment. And so it's such a fascinating conversation to explore together with like another practitioner of like, how do we do this? How do we do this work?
I mean, what I boil it down to, as I said, I don't know how to, because you can't do a controlled experiment like, oh, let's do this whole thing over again and not cover them up and see what happens.
Right.
10 years later, are they in a better place?
Right.
So I just know when I did something because a part needed to do it. And I know when I let it all go, and then I trusted something and intervened or didn't intervene.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, and just to say that, because we've been kind of thinking this one about because in holotropic breathwork, at least it's clear, like you do make ground rules. And
right.
So everyone knows, like if someone's yelling, don't complain about it. That's part of it.
Yeah, bring
right?
it in.
Yeah, so that's on you to like, what's your reaction to that? And we also say don't talk, because that legitimately can take people out of the non-ordinary state. So having the ground rules at least guides us. And then people find really interesting ways to just walk that line where are they bending that rule or breaking that rule? And so for ketamine, it's such a quieter thing. And right now we're electing to say the ground rules are you're welcome to make sounds. And most people don't, but sometimes people have. And so far people aren't complaining that it was too disruptive. They seem to roll with it, but we're open. That may change. And we may decide, you know what, let's just keep it quiet. And I mean, I've seen shamans in ayahuasca and someone makes a sound, they go, shut up.
Yeah.
You have to leave.
Well, it's interesting. And I've been kind of really thinking about this in like the breathwork model. It seems like okay to make a lot of those loud sounds, having a lot of, emotional catharsis. And then, in some of the medicine sessions, it's like, do we get too sensitive to certain things? And I've been in kind of like group psilocybin experiences where somebody laughing across the room is really triggering somebody else and they want them to be quiet. And, is it a different model, where it's like breath work, it's almost like okay. And I have been in sessions where people have been really triggered by the amount of catharsis in breathwork sessions. And, it kind of really triggered folks in some pretty negative ways. But it is interesting, like how much catharsis do we allow to happen? And maybe that does come back to ground rules and what people feel comfortable with. And
I guess there's room for it all, right? Like our style might be to allow it and someone else might do something similar and invite people to just stay quiet. And if someone's making noise, intervene, and hopefully people will gravitate to whatever works for them. But as we're saying, you never know. So I'm looking across the room at what we call the cube in core energetics, and there's a bat on there.
Oh,
and
yes.
It just always comes up, I think, in every cohort we've done, that some people need or want to work with anger.
Yeah.
And so last weekend, we had some people express anger with that thing, and a couple people got triggered and did a really good job of staying in the room even. And it really opened up a lot about their history and parts of them that had been terrorized. And so in a way, as that's happening, they could have said, this sucks. Like, why are you doing this? It's horrible. And thankfully, both of these people were able to go, okay, something's being activated here and I'm curious about it.
Yeah. And are you pulling that out, like I'm guessing towards the end of a session when I'm probably not in the middle, but like towards the end and having people use that?
No, we haven't felt right to do it after the ketamine.
Yeah.
So we circle before we take the medicine, or I shouldn't say we because the facilitators aren't doing it, and that's mostly to check in, but we've been taking time before the medicine to do some process. And so we'll do it before then. And it's very typical that people will say that the action of hitting that thing and fully expressing anger and moving energy through blocks in their body inform their ketamine session to kind of open things up for them going into the session.
Yeah. Can you explain that technique a little bit more? I've done it. And it was actually really, really challenging and it felt super vulnerable. And the person I was doing it with said within therapy, sometimes they don't even bring that block out until like 6 months or more. And
not that nice. Sure. Well, there's the way I see it. So first of all, I want to say people can go, oh, core energetics. That's just where you hit stuff. So no, core energetics is like a lot more than that. But this is maybe my favorite little tool. And so on one level, it's as I said, it's just moving energy. And we're always like blocked and clenched. And parts of us are afraid to experience the full flow of energy in our body. And so the way we have people physically hit this thing is really useful for just opening that up. But on a psychological level, most of us grow up with some very distorted programming about anger. Like anger's bad, it's destructive, it's terrifying. And anger as a part that is in the driver's seat but anger that's self-led is protective in a in the best way, and it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
It creates boundaries, and we need to have boundaries. And a lot of people who are anxious, imagine you live in a dangerous environment. You don't have a door, you're going to be anxious.
Yeah.
And if you're depressed, often it's because, one whole theory of depression is that your anger is afraid to express out and it's coming back at you. It's the only safe place to release anger is sort of back at the self, and that causes depression. So just to invite people to welcome angry parts is really wonderful. And often they have to get in touch with the parts that learned how scary anger can be. And that was real for them too, because growing up, when you're really little and a big person is being angry, that is terrifying.
Yeah. How do you work with that in session? Like, does that come up in session with anger with ketamine, or are people just very quiet?
Like in an individual session when someone did a mini dose of ketamine?
Yeah. We'll talk individual session.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had someone hit that after having done some ketamine. I'm not saying it wouldn't happen, but it doesn't feel like the vibe.
Yeah. As we're talking about this, and for those, need a little bit more visual, this is like a foam block, probably like hip high, pretty wide. And you do a baseball bat. I've done it with a tennis racket.
Yeah, I like the bat better. I think it's 3x4x5, so you can turn it different ways.
Yeah.
Hit it with the bat.
And I think I actually had somebody do that before a ketamine session, and there was a lot of anger that started coming up. But I remember them telling me that it actually helped to like process it beforehand, and to really kind of tap into it. And it showed up pretty somatically in their body, like a lot of tight hands, a lot of kind of like vocalization, and really trying to help that person get that out of their system a little bit more, which, again, I guess it could be a little bit harder in group sessions where you're probably trying to manage a lot more energy versus doing that on an individual level. But from IFS, like, how do you work with anger? Working with these parts, like, I'm guessing, having these parts communicate.
Yeah, from an IFS approach, in IFS, we don't call parts their things. Like, we don't say, oh, that's the angry part. Like, parts can feel whatever they feel. But I do get the sense that we have a part whose job it is to manifest anger, to create boundaries and reinforce boundaries as needed. So I think welcoming that part into the body is really important. And to do that, we have to explore the parts that are in trauma around anger.
Yeah. And you said you don't call the parts in IFS, say, the angry part. What are the parts in IFS for those that don't know anything about it?
Well, in some, IFS isn't the only model that understands that we have parts. And some of them sort of say, like I did one, you have 7 parts. And then they made this thing on the floor and you could stand in each one, and be that part. So in IFS, we don't pigeonhole parts. It's just, they are what they are. And one of the qualities of self is curiosity. So we just want to get to know, like, who are you? What are you up to? What are you feeling? What do you need?
You mentioned something about shamanism, and I wrote down soul retrieval. And I've heard, I think, yes, an IFS trained therapist years ago said, like, IFS feels like this mix between shamanism and psychotherapy. And I've had people ask me this, like, could you kind of do what would, I guess, be called a soul retrieval from the shamanic perspective with IFS? And I don't know if that's like anything that you've explored or have context around. And, maybe it's a different context.
I know I've experienced soul retrieval with like Sandra Ingerman back in the day, and I don't remember exactly what happened there, but IFS definitely includes shamanic practices. And one of Dick's colleagues named Michi Rose, a student of shamanism, and she sort of helped develop the model and brought in these techniques. So who we retrieve are the exiles. So the exiles, I see them as, like when I do IFS, I feel we're time traveling. And so I'll invite my client to go to time travel into the past and show up in a scene where the trauma is happening. And then that energy of self can intervene and do whatever this exile needed to have happen. And I'm going to go a little more with this because I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
That replaying the scene, I think, is doing what's called memory deconsolidation. And I'm sure we're not going to get into that too much now, but if anyone wants to look it up, it's the work of Bruce Ecker. And the pairing of the traumatic memory with kind of replaying the scene with the outcome that should have happened, really, which sort of an opposite outcome, theoretically is preventing that traumatic memory from going back into storage. So it's effectively neutralizing it. But then once all that's done, then we invite this exile to leave the scene, and it can go anywhere that it wants to go. But I like to bring them into the present. I think that's the best place. So I want my exiles here in the present with me. I live here.
Right.
And they need me. And so in order for them to feel connected to me, they should be in the present with me. So we retrieve them from the past, bring them into the present.
That's interesting to think about. I remember actually doing a short little IFS demonstration. I don't know, it was like 30 minutes with Dick for our training program. And I think that was the first time I brought forward a part of myself from the past. Because usually I feel like when I'm doing it, it's still kind of like back there. Like I'm just thinking about like maybe breath work or some of these other experiences. It feels like, oh, I'm reliving that in the past and kind of doing some sort of like reconsolidation of whatever's going on there. But to bring it into the future and into the present, that's really interesting to think about. How do you bring that part of you in the here and now and start to work with it?
You just ask it.
Yeah.
Would you like to come and be in the present? And usually go, yeah, get me out of here. Like, I don't like it back here. And sometimes the present is difficult too, but these parts can understand that they have access to self in the present. And often that's going to be a better situation for them than however they were growing up.
Yeah.
So they tend to want to, not always. And if they don't want to come, we would explore why not and understand that.
Yeah. You mentioned there's just this concept around like time traveling. And one of the things that kind of popped in my head was this concept of double bookkeeping, which we kind of talk about in the breathwork world as well. And how does that relate to the work that we're doing? And how do you kind of interpret that term, double bookkeeping?
I don't know it. Are you saying that?
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe it's something that Lenny brings up. Maybe it's something that didn't come from holotropic breathwork.
That's right. Yeah. That's probably Lenny's thing.
Yeah.
I'm imagining you're saying that like if I'm talking to someone and I'm getting triggered, now I'm having an experience now, but there's also something historically that's being played out at the same time.
Yeah, essentially. And I guess the way we describe it too is like, you're on the mat physically, you're wherever you're at. We're here in North Carolina, but I'm also like reliving this experience of maybe a past life of living in the jungle and the jaguar is coming. And how do we stay in both of those realities? And I found that to be like a really interesting concept to play around with somatically of like, how do I stay in my body and then also let this narrative unfold as it's happening in the present moment?
Yeah. Well, so this is one of the things that I think psychedelics bring to the therapeutic work, which is to make a bigger space within our psyche for contradictions and opposites. And yes, it's both true. Like I'm there and I'm here. It's both true. And I think how breathwork achieves deconsolidation, it's different than IFS, but it's the same idea because here you are reliving an intense, difficult, traumatic experience and at the same time feeling the comfort of the room and your mat and someone's just there for whatever you need. I believe that is the what Bruce Ecker calls a prediction error. That's the contradictory experience that can neutralize the memory.
Right. And just thinking about, I guess from the somatic perspective, it's like when you are reliving that and you're having that sense of safety, it's helping to kind of resolve maybe that traumatic experience. It's like, okay, I can be in that experience in the present moment, knowing I'm safe, and then starting to feel a little bit better about maybe how to approach that when that memory or that experience comes into the present moment.
I think there's so many things. I mean, part of it is, we could feel better about it. We get used to the feelings, so we're not afraid of the feelings. But if you get that that's a part what is post-traumatic stress disorder? It's just a part stuck in the past, in trauma. Something happens, and it could be just a glance from somebody. It could be anything.
Yeah.
That memory, and it's not the episodic memory, it's the emotional memory in the amygdala, right? It's just the feeling of it. Sometimes that memory thing is like a button gets pushed, it starts playing. And is it real or is it Memorex? Like there's no way to know from the feeling if this feeling is relevant to what just happened, like what that person just said to me, or am I now having feelings from a 5-year-old part of me who is being berated by my teacher or something? So by bringing these parts into the present, we're reducing the number of times that these old memories are going to just get triggered, because the parts, I feel they're just not back there anymore. They're here in the present.
Right. And for some of those parts, say like a younger part of yourself, and if, talking about bringing it into the present moment, is it okay to like have that part maybe grow up? Like, say if you're dealing with like my 4-year-old self, it's like trying to, I'm just thinking about my experience with Dick. It was like, it was scared. It didn't want to do certain things. And, is part of that process is actually maybe getting it up to speed and be like, you're not a 4-year-old anymore, right? Like you're here, you're in this moment. And so do those parts evolve? And is that also part of the work?
That is such an interesting question. And I can only say that a part of me thinks they don't and they shouldn't grow up. And a part of me thinks I need to follow the lead of my clients. And occasionally a client will tell me that their part is getting older. I don't know. I wonder if we're wanting them to get older and that they are the age they are. I don't know. But what is important is that they know that I grew up.
Right.
And often a really cool question to ask a part is like, how old do you think the person is?
Right.
And the part will say, well, they're 9. I said, oh, okay. Well, that explains a lot. If you think you're being taken care of by a 9-year-old, that explains a lot. So when they get that their person, like the self of that person has a lot more experience and ability to hold space and power in the world, that's really helpful for them.
Yeah. Yeah, this stuff is so fascinating. And I think it pairs so well with non-ordinary experiences and holotropic states. Just thinking about, some of my own personal experiences. And it's like, I was doing parts work and maybe not knowing it, right? Like calling it like, oh, here's my angry part. Oh, here's my younger part. And it just seems like such a natural synthesis and a really great tool for integration and also thinking about how to work with these experiences a little bit more. And so, I'm glad that you're doing this work. I'm glad that Dick has put this framework out as well for people to study and learn about. And I don't know, do you view integrating of psychedelic and breathwork experiences as trying to help to integrate these parts in a way? And what does integration mean? I think I forget if I asked Dick this, and I think he said like, it's not to integrate it in like a sense that they all need to grow up and be interacting the same way. But I don't know. How do you view this?
Can I go say something about the last thing first?
Yes.
Because it's interesting, you're saying that in the non-ordinary state, we can kind of experience how parts work. But also, in my experience, when you start to talk to people about parts, they go into a non-ordinary state.
Yeah.
And I started working with parts, being trained in hypnotherapy. And when I learned IFS, I just found people will go into that exact same trance state just by asking them to talk to parts. And I didn't have to spend 20 minutes, have them walk down a bunch of stairs and play, tinkly music and stuff. So it's almost like IFS itself is a non-ordinary state when people are talking to parts.
Do we need psychedelics then?
We got all these wonderful tools, I don't know if we need any of it, but and now I forget what the question you asked.
The other part was like, how do you view integration from an IFS perspective? Like, how do we integrate parts?
To me, so like you're saying, it's not like you mush everything together right? So it's like differentiation where the parts are who they are, they're separate, but they're connected. And I think the main thing is that they're connected to self, so that from that place of self, I can feel and know and accept and be related to all of my parts. I do think, as a bonus, sometimes they can get more friendly with each other. So especially parts that are polarized and fighting each other can sometimes get the sense like, you know what, we're kind of on the same team here, which is nice.
Yeah.
So integration, it feels more like that all my parts are welcome.
As you're talking about this, I'm just thinking about kind of family work. And, it's that old Ram Dass saying, like, you think you're enlightened, go spend the weekend with your family, and kind of really notice how those systems activate so much stuff. But then a friend of mine told me this story. I don't know how true it is. I couldn't find it anywhere online, that when Ram Dass's father was dying, he was already at that point like an international, celebrity guru. And then he's like sitting at home with his father and needing to eat like hot dogs and macaroni and watch baseball and not change it. And I think about that with like, family work and family dynamics, right? Of wanting to maybe change as we're changing, or do we show up and honor like, this person is who they are, and how do maybe I find a little bit more either compassion or empathy with how they are as a person, and do I need to try to change that?
To me, it's the same question about, do I intervene or not intervene? Like if I'm comfortable with my exiles that are involved in the question, I can be comfortable letting my father eat hot dogs, or I don't really know what the thing was, but I can just let it be. And I'm also comfortable with taking a chance on trying to change something. And then between those two extremes, I can feel what's most likely to produce the best outcome.
Yeah. I don't know how we're doing on time. I haven't really been keeping track of time, but there's something that I wanted to touch on before we run out of time. Before we got recording, we were talking about insight, and is insight always real from those downloads? And I think this is just like an interesting question to explore. Like when we do have like a really big download insight from these holotropic states, from psychedelics, like how much of it feels real, and how do we like really discern what's going on there?
Okay. Well, one, maybe if our logical and limiting parts step back enough, there's room in our space for more than one reality. So we don't have to say what reality is. But also, I think, I don't remember so in breathwork, we'll tell people after, don't make any changes for a week. Is that what we say? Like a week?
Yeah, or like 3 months. Or
3 months? Okay.
Depends what the change is.
Yeah. So, but I had an experience doing ketamine where I started thinking like, wow, this is very different than last time, and it's the same dose. And I started thinking like, different people in our groups are having very different experiences on the same amount of medicine. And are they really like making these uniform? And I kind of got convinced that everyone's getting different doses when they cut up their troches. And then when I was more normal, I thought about it, and then I actually called the pharmacy, and she says, well, yeah, like we get trained in this, like by law, we have to know how to do this and make it be uniform. It's like, oh yeah, that's true. So in a way, the idea that it was not uniform, I think was wrong. But the willingness to question it was good.
Right.
Because how many things are like that we just accept and don't question? So I guess on one level, it was a good insight, but it didn't translate into like, I got to go make sure they make the troches better.
Right. That's funny. And I mean, I guess that also comes back to like the potency of our inner worlds. And I always come back to that concept of that non-specific amplifier, right? Sometimes you can take the same dose, same setting, and the inner world is going to show us something different each time. And so hard to kind of predict what's happening.
Yes. So once I gave up the theory that the troches were not uniform, that's the theory I have to end up with.
But yeah, I mean, and I think there's a lot of nuance here as well. That going back to that concept of, don't make any big changes for a week, 2 weeks, month, 3 months, 6 months. I think there are those times when you do get a really good insight. And I always say, like, if it's something that's been like somebody's been ruminating on for a while. Like I had a friend that, came to me one time after a breathwork training. He's like, well, I did the thing that they told us not to do, and I made a big life decision. And but it was something that they were thinking about for months, right? And I think about that window of opportunity and thinking about maybe those neuroplastic windows of like, oh, now somebody actually has a little bit of motivation to make change. And maybe, they do have the energy to make that change, or depending on the type of insight it is, right? Like I've definitely had insights where it was going to be a very big life shift. And I'm glad that I actually didn't go through with it. In the time, it sounded like, oh, this is a great idea. I'll just completely quit X, Y, and Z, start over and do this. And I'm like, wow, I'm so glad I didn't do that. I'm glad I stuck with it.
Well, here's one way to look at it, I guess, that we have polarized parts. Mm. So one part might be in charge of making sure we're living life to the fullest and being adventurous. And another part might have the job of making sure that we're stable and safe. And if one of those parts has been suppressed, and then through a non-ordinary state, it comes out and we get to feel it, right? Like if you had been kept out of the conversation for years, when you got listened to, you'd want to just make your thing happen because you'd be afraid that you're going to just get exiled again. Right. So that part might say, do it, do it, do it. But we were saying earlier about consent, that any decision we make that all our parts don't consent to, it could by chance end up being good. But really self-leadership means we have consent for all decisions. Even if it's reluctant, it doesn't mean parts are going to be enthusiastic. If they go, oh my God, I really don't want us to do that, but if that's what you need to do, okay, I'll sign it. I think that's fine. So I think having enough time to let the original part that was dominant come back into the room and be heard is important. And the work would be, who are the exiles? So like, if my adventurous part was suppressed because of fears of failure or losing everything and or being broke or being judged, and then I do that work where I'm not afraid to feel those parts that feel like a failure or feel judged.
Yeah.
Then I'm free to really make a choice. So that whole experience could lead to the work. The work leads to being capable of choosing either option, and then you really have a choice.
As you're saying, like that excited part, maybe wanting to speak up and afraid of being exiled again, that reminded me of a situation, and I'm wondering if you've stumbled across these situations, and I forget if there's like a particular term for it, but sometimes you do see it in group work where somebody all of a sudden they go through these really powerful experiences, and then they feel the confidence of wanting to share something extremely vulnerable to the group. And then they share that. And then that part comes back online later and goes, why did you do that? And that huge kind of shame response kicks in, and then they curl back up. Do you know if there's a specific term for that? Or, have you seen that in groups? And
like blowback? Or,
maybe. I don't know.
But for the shame part, no, I totally know what you mean. And I would assume if that happened, the part whose job it is to gauge the listening and to prevent being judged, and that moment was pushed aside, right? And when I do groups, it's all about that, right? It's all about sharing what's vulnerable, and that creates a safety in the group that's amazing and juicy. But sometimes people will say, well, there's something I want to talk about and I'm really afraid to, but I'm going to do it. I say, hold on. Check. Check with all your parts. Like, are they going to give you permission for this, or are you just pushing them aside?
Makes me think about just like testing edges a little bit. Like, and I kind of talk about this, like, about sharing experiences, like kind of doing a little bit of fishing, like kind of tossing stuff out there, see how the group responds. But I wonder if you can really do that with your parts. If like, you just get out of a session, you're feeling like, I really need to share this extremely vulnerable thing. Like, can you titrate that a bit and then just share like maybe one little piece and then check in with that other part that's like, whoa, slow down, or, oh, actually, this is feeling okay. Maybe we can go a little bit further. So maybe even just developing that relationship where people are titrating it and becoming aware of like just checking in along the way. How are all the parts doing? How are they feeling? Oh, okay. And I'm noticing like maybe I can push this edge a little bit more. Maybe that part will allow me to do that instead of just tossing it all out and then having that blowback like a day or a week later being like, oh my God, why did I share all that stuff in front of these people?
Yeah. So what you just said sounds like self-leadership to me, right? Like if you were in charge of a bunch of people and one wanted to do the thing and one had concerns, that's exactly what you would do. You would say, well, would it be okay if we did this a little bit and see what happens? And then the one that had concerns might go, okay, a little bit. And then you do that. And they say, well, how about now? Could we do a little bit more? So to get consent from all the parts involves negotiating sometimes. Like, what would you need to be able to do this? And could we do a little bit, like you said?
Yeah. So important reminders, folks, as you're kind of entering into this space and thinking about working with these parts. Ted, this has been great. I think we're over time. Where can people find you? You have an online presence. Any offerings that are coming up, either online or locally here outside the Asheville area?
Yes. Well, the thing we're talking about here, we call it Group KAP. So it's just www.groupkap.com.
It's a wonderful domain name.
Yeah, we grabbed that.
Got lucky.
And we have 2 more cohorts on the calendar for September and October. And we do month-longs for people in the area. So we didn't get into this, but I'm really liking a week between sessions and then a Monday night in between for processing. And so we have one of those on the calendar. And then we have what we call an intensive for people who want to come visit Asheville for a week, which is, as you're experiencing, a nice place to visit. And we'll tend to do 3 sessions in a week.
Oh, okay,
and then people can come home or go home. So we have that happening during fall foliage for people who want to come see the trees here. And so that's what's on the calendar there. And I also teach IFS to practitioners. And we have a new cohort coming up in September. And that is at ifsessentials.com.
Is that online? Or
That's
is it
online teaching.
Awesome. Yeah. And so people check that out. I know it's hard to get into IFS workshops and trainings nowadays. So it's great to know that you're a resource in teaching this stuff. So Ted, thank you. Anything else that you want to close with for today?
No, just thank you, Kyle. Really had a good time talking to you and glad we could do this.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Ted Riskin. I know I had a blast and just really grateful and thankful that Ted invited me to his place to check out where they do their group ketamine and breathwork sessions and all that stuff. And as I've been mentioning on these episodes where we're back in person, it's just been so nice to just sit down with people in person and be able to record some of these interviews versus being on Zoom recording these. So thanks again, Ted, for the time and for inviting me to your place. And again, if you want to learn more about Ted's work, if you are in the North Carolina area and you want to maybe check out some of the offerings that they're having, you can check out their website, groupkap.com. That's KAP as KAP, so groupkap.com, or you could check out Ted's personal website, tedriskin.com. I was just kind of scrolling through some of our notes and kind of going over the episode since it's been a while. And I love this quote here, or what Ted said about breath work. We've been deep in the breath work, coming out of retreats recently. And I just always love hearing people's feedback around the power of breath. And so this one caught my eye, and I just want to reiterate it, even though you just heard it in the episode. I think it's important. So Ted was mentioning, I think people underestimate the power of breath work these days a lot more people are coming to do breath work for the first time after they have done a psychedelic. In the past, that was a minority. Now it's probably the majority. And I tell them the difference is you're used to riding a motorcycle, and now this is a bicycle. You got to pedal this one. And they're shocked sometimes how deep the breathing takes them. So I just love that because, I'm always reminded why Joe and I, got together and started Psychedelics Today back in, 2016. It was really to talk about the work of Stan Groff and really kind of highlight the potential and the power of breath work. And, now as, psychedelics are starting to become more popular and people are starting to kind of dive in the deep end, I think breath work and some of these other tools, somatic practices and what we were chatting about in the episode around IFS are really important. And I think breath work is going to be a really important tool for the psychedelic movement. It is a way to maybe help to integrate somebody's process, to go back in to do the work. I just always like to highlight that when it comes to breath work, since it's important. So I think that's it. Again, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, feel free to send us an email, info@psychedelicstoday.com. And if you are interested in joining any of our upcoming events, such as one of our breathwork retreats, go to psychedelicstoday.com, events, and a reminder, we do have a breathwork retreat coming up in January. That's January 6th to the 13th. Down in Costa Rica. So maybe it's time to dive in and pedal that bike and get off the motorcycle and find other ways to explore. So with that, I hope you're having a beautiful day whenever you're listening to this, and we will catch you on the next episode of Psychedelics Today.